Here's Ray again, our tinsmith. I wanted to talk a little bit about using light properties, in particular reflection, as part of the structure of a composition. What David and I talk about often is that all of this is instinctive. We're not planning, saying, we're going to make a reflection, we're going to make this angle of light. It's that we are creating it as we go, and it's part of it's as transparent to us as our cameras are. We know our cameras backwards and forwards. We know our lights. We know our equipment so that we don't have to think about it. We just use them as appropriate. And the same is true with composition, light, shadow. It's all part of the palette of our art. As I said earlier, I wanted to use the properties of tin within the creation of the portraits of Ray. And of course, the reflection of him into it was just so natural. You must know that it's exactly the same light setup as the other. I simply moved myself in order to bring that reflection in further and to get closer to his hands and to create the angles that I had there. And it just all came together in a moment. And as I was shooting it, I knew exactly what I was shooting. When I was saying instinctive, it doesn't mean that there isn't a great deal of thinking in it. You know exactly when you see it in the viewfinder what you have. But the light is still sculpting, but light as reflection as well as light with shadow.
That's a really interesting point. Light as reflection as well as light and shadow. I look at this, and this image is, to me, one that's presented in at least two layers. The first layer is the obvious one, with the hands working with the materials. But the second layer is the reflection of his face. And the light there is qualitatively and quantitatively different. And yet it all works together very harmoniously. It's as if it puts the viewer of the photograph in the workshop with the craftsman. And I really like the image for that feeling. It's the kind of image that if you had added a lot of other light to fill in some of these other shadows, you really wouldn't have separation of foreground and midground. And you wouldn't have that sense of dimensionality. And working with simplicity in this light, in lighting this situation, worked extremely well. I also like the use of color. The color in the hands is more saturated than the color in the midground or background. And that brings the hands forward. And so it works very, very well in that respect. I also like your comment about the tools or the technology being transparent, in that a painter doesn't think about what bristles are on this paintbrush. And similarly, I think photographers, after a period of time, begin not to think so much of the camera and think much more about the subject. And the reverse is true for people who are just getting started. They're thinking a lot about the camera. And over time, the camera becomes transparent, I think is the word that you used, and that's a good thing. We talked a little bit earlier about whether photographs are inventions or discoveries, and I think, again, the answer is probably both. In the case of this image, it's definitely both. There's invention in the sense that you were moving until you saw what you needed to see, but then there's also a sense of discovery in this image in the way his face is reflected in the material back at the viewer. So it works on a lot of different levels, and it's very pleasing.
I recently did the exhibition print of this, and I decided that I wanted to have not just the Ray's reflection, but the viewer's reflection in it. So I went back to Ray, and I got a piece of tin, and I mounted the picture onto tin so that you'd have a distorted, the tin gives this very muted reflection. It's not a perfect reflection. But so the viewer sees themselves framing this picture, and I mounted that onto wood so that I have the gray of the tin, but then I return to the colors of the picture with the wood staining that I did. So to me, the installation, the mounting, the framing of a picture